Paul Fletcher, who's going to be our first speaker this morning, very much falls into that group. So Paul is a psychiatrist by trade. He's an academic, and his modality of study is imaging, largely. And I've really enjoyed hearing him speak over the years as part of the wider group of people doing brain sciences in Cambridge, and it was a real pleasure when you accepted our invitation to come and talk, Paul. So thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much for a very gracious introduction. It really wasn't a difficult decision. I was delighted. The only thing that disappoints me is that I can't stay for the whole conference, nor could I see Irene Tracy's reportedly excellent talk last night. So when I was sent the title for my talk, I initially thought, well, I must change that. There's nothing I can say about disbelief particularly. And then I thought, no, I'll see if I can keep the title and see if it modifies the way I give my talk, and see if I can rise to the challenge. I'm disappointed to say that I don't think I have risen to the challenge, but nonetheless I'm going to devote some of this talk to thinking about belief. And this, I think, is from the perspective of somebody who's essentially an enthusiastic amateur. I don't think knowing about the brain really entails knowing about belief. I think it might put you in a position to say some things, some sensible, some not so sensible things about belief, but I don't think I have any particularly privileged insight into beliefs themselves or to disbelief. So I'm going to content myself with thinking about situations in which beliefs and perceptions seem to be perturbed in some way. And that essentially will be unpacked through thinking about psychosis. But before I do that, I thought it would be relevant to just mention, some of you probably already know this, but it's a very fitting institution within which to talk about beliefs and perceptions, because when the spiritualism, necromancy, table-turning fashion of the mid-19th century was reaching its height, and people of like-minded persuasion would gather together in dark rooms and commune with the spirit world, and the spirit world would commune back with them by making the table move. There was a general sense of discomfort among some people that actually this was some sort of deception or illusion. And in fact, it was Michael Faraday who designed a very clever apparatus that showed that the force that was generating the movement of the table was actually coming from the hands of the necromancers. And this theme of having a particular expectation, and that expectation generating or changing the world to provide evidence in its own favour, is something that I want to return to, because I think it's very important in thinking about beliefs across all domains, including scientific, in fact, possibly especially scientific. So, as an overview, I'm going to begin by thinking about what psychosis is and why it's hard to understand. And why I'm doing that, I hope will become clear. I'd then like to take a step back and think about how we might understand this seemingly incomprehensible situation by actually just thinking about how all of us are processing the world, how we're all trying desperately to predict a noisy, ambiguous, uncertain, inconsistent world. And that leads to this idea that actually our perceptions themselves are beliefs, or their inferences. I'd then like to think about psychosis as just a simple shift in this normal process. And throughout the talk, I hope what will be clear is that I think of this, what's traditionally been thought of in psychiatry as an incomprehensible major mental illness, is actually in some ways a variant of the normal state, and something that all of us have to some degree. And indeed, under certain circumstances, it may well be that the person who has the diagnosis of psychosis has certain advantages. And in the end, this is in trying to uphold my adherence to this challenge of thinking about belief. I want to step back and ask, well, when we think about what we do know about this major mental symptom or set of symptoms, can we use that in the traditional neuropsychological way, where you treat it as a lesion model, if you like? So for example, within neuropsychology, if you find somebody who can't speak and you can identify the brain areas that are damaged, you're treating that as a lesion model for unpacking the components of language. Maybe we can use instances like this to inform our understanding of belief. So to begin with, what is psychosis? Well, it's not a diagnosis. It doesn't actually have any meaning in terms of underlying pathophysiology or mechanistic disruptions. It's actually just a rough descriptive term that refers to a so-called loss of contact with objective reality. So we're already in a slightly contentious area because the notion of what objective reality is and whether somebody has lost contact with it is up for a lot of discussion in most situations. People tend to then fall back on describing it in terms of two sets of experiences or phenomena. One is hallucinations, and a hallucination is defined as a perception without a stimulus. In other words, when you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell something that isn't objectively there in the outside world. And then there's a delusion, which is defined as an abnormal belief. It's a belief that's deemed to be irrationally arrived at, held strongly even in the face of contradictory evidence, and out of keeping with one's socio-cultural background. So this is even more contentious than hallucinations. A delusion essentially is a belief that nobody understands why you have it and they don't share it. And these are the building blocks of diagnosing a person who's having psychosis. Now, psychosis is deemed to be a core feature of schizophrenia, and of course schizophrenia is yet another contentious area that probably is multiple syndromes within an overall broad description. But it's not in itself schizophrenia. So psychosis occurs in many, many different situations. And there's a lot of interest in the possibility that it's actually a continuous trait distributed across the entire population, with all of us having some propensity towards it. And in fact, I think most of us have probably had isolated hallucinations. Well, I won't make any inferences about you, but I probably have quite a number of delusions. I think when scientists look at brain images and superimpose their own reality upon these very noisy patterns, there's something sometimes quite delusional about that. So here's an example from a young woman that I saw. This is quite some time ago. I went out to see her in Peterborough. Her family were worried that she was becoming increasingly isolated and withdrawn. And she told me about this very disturbing but interesting phenomenon where she would have a fight with her sister, and then she could hear her sister whispering about her. Even when her sister wasn't in the room or even outside the room or even in the house, she could hear her sister's voice. And this voice was nasty, saying nasty things about her. And that would be defined as an auditory verbal hallucination. Hearing a voice when there is no objective cause of that. There is no voice that other people can hear. Here's an example of a delusion, a so-called delusion of reference, a belief that the newspapers or the internet or whatever are referring directly to you. Not just relevant to you, but referring to you, talking about you, talking to you. And this is a classic, what they call first-rank symptom. If you get this, the diagnosis of schizophrenia is thought to be almost clinched. So we have a hallucination and a delusion. And actually, the reality for me is that it's very difficult to distinguish between the two things, but we can come back to that. The point I want to make is that we're in very boggy territory here. It's extraordinarily difficult to think of psychosis in terms of lesions. In essence, to be psychotic, to have these experiences, is to be incredibly creative, to construct a world that you then inhabit and that you populate with voices and phantasms and terror. It's a world within which you're deeply immersed, and it's very hard to think of some gross derangement or loss of function that could cause that. And that's illustrated very poignantly in this old film of a man in a mental institution in America in the 1950s. So how can we begin to make sense of it? Well, this is the essence of really what I want to say about it, actually. I think that we can think about these phenomena, delusions, false beliefs, and hallucinations, false perceptions, in the context of normal perceptual inferential processing. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that the normal perceptual inferential system is one that actually is riding or is harnessing hallucinatory processes. It's using them to its advantage in order to predict and understand the world. And we can think of psychosis actually as being potentially a very subtle shift in the way in which these processes are being enacted. And this leads on to the idea that psychosis in us all is not such a fanciful notion, both in terms of normal processing, as I'll show you, and also this phenomenon that people talk about called schizotypy, which is a sort of trait within us that may be more or less psychotic. So the starting point is to think about normal perceptual and inferential processing. And for me, a starting point is this really remarkable paper that I came across. It's from 1970, actually. Ross Ashby's a very interesting chap. So he's a psychiatrist and cybernetician. Has a whole website devoted to his writings, which is well worth looking at. And he and Roger Conant came up with this beautifully titled paper, Every Good Regulator of a System Must Be a Model of That System. And the essential idea here is, if we strip away everything about the brain, apart from the real basics, we get as reductionist as we care to be. We employ a sort of method of doubt in which all of the good stuff, the poetry, the love, romance, etc., put that to one side. What could this organ function in pursuit of? And the idea is that it's a system that's trying to regulate another system in pursuit of stability. Stability equals survival. So a good organ that pursues survival will mitigate the impact of transitions in a dynamic system through transitions in itself in order to maintain its own stability and thereby survive. Forgive me for being so reductionist, but the 2 points that come out of this are, one, Conant and Ashby proved in this paper that if one system is trying to regulate another system, it must be a model of that system in order to do that optimally and efficiently. And here's the clincher for me. I sat back and when I read this sentence, because it seemed to me so inherently true. You may disagree with it, but for me, I think it's a really important statement. The theorem has the interesting corollary that the living brain, so far as it is to be successful or efficient as a regulator for survival, must proceed in learning by the formation of a model of its environment. The brain is a model of its world. It recapitulates in its own structure and function the associated regularities around us. I think that's a truth, but then again, it could be a delusion. This presents us with a problem. How can the brain model the world? It has so little to go on. Vernon Mountcastle, the physiologist, put it very beautifully. He said, all of us live within the universe or the prison of our own brain. Projecting from it are millions of fragile sensory nerve endings, arranged in groups uniquely adapted to sample the energetic states of the world: heat, light, force, chemical composition. That's all we know it directly. Everything else is logical inference. The question is, how can we assemble heat, light, force, chemical composition into some meaningful picture of the world? Because we all have the sense that the world paints itself directly onto us, that we have some direct contact with that reality. But our sensory nerve fibers are just telling us heat, light, force, chemical composition. Mountcastle said, all else is logical inference, and I think there's something very powerful about that assertion. We see this all the time, actually, in optical illusions. So, to most of you looking at this, you will see a reasonably decent model of a sort of pointed arch on vertical pillars. And that's your clear perception, I hope. But actually, when you see what happens when somebody puts ball bearings, they seem to do something that disobeys the laws of physics. And there's a good reason for that. It's because what we're seeing, what we're inferring about this picture is actually incorrect, and you can see that when you take another view of it, which is that it wasn't what you'd originally expected it to be. So these optical illusions are great in giving us an insight into where our inference is wrong in the face of the objective reality. But what is the nature of the inference? Well, clever people have said clever things about it, and I just want to allude to some of them because I think they're important. Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a 19th century physiologist and genius, observed the following. He said, objects are always imagined as being present in the visual field as would have to be there in order to create the same impression on the nervous mechanism. What he was essentially saying is that you have an impression on your nervous mechanism and you imagine what could have caused that. You take the data and work out what the cause was. And actually this is a form of inference that Charles Peirce, early 20th century philosopher, referred to as abductive inference. So, and I should add in passing that Max Coltart, a very powerful theorist about delusions, has thought a lot about delusions in the context of abductive inference. So Charles Peirce referred to abductive inference as reasoning backwards from the data to the cause, which is what we really shouldn't do, ever, because it's so ropey compared to induction and deduction, but it's what we do. He described it as a guess. In fact, he said the whole fabric of our knowledge is a matted felt of pure hypothesis. But actually, if that really were the case, we wouldn't be anywhere near as successful as we are. So there must be something that constrains this abductive inference. I mean, just to labour the point slightly, our abductive inference here is that the data that are imposing upon our retina and visual cortex are best explained by a pointed arch. Now the reality is, the actual data could be anywhere between this and this. There could be an infinite set of permutations that could lead this pattern to be imposed upon our retina, and yet we see it not as a sort of blur of possibilities, we see it as a pointed arch. And the reason we see it as a pointed arch is actually captured by the Reverend, Presbyterian minister from the 18th century, Reverend Thomas Bayes, who essentially observed, and I don't want to get into Bayesian stuff, but essentially observed that our abductive inference is defined not just by the sensory input, what's referred to as the likelihood, but by the prior expectation. And so mixing those two together, we've got what we've got coming in, we've also got prior expectation, and it's the prior expectation that helps us to disambiguate what's coming in. So in short, all I've said so far, it's taken me slightly too long to say it, the brain strives to be a model of the world. It has sensory inputs and it must infer the causes of those inputs. That's the logical inference that Mountcastle referred to. This inference is horribly imprecise. It really is unconstrained, and we can only constrain it by using our prior expectations. And if we do use our prior expectations, we have a great deal of success. So I want to illustrate that with a few examples. So to many of you, I imagine, who haven't seen this before, this will look like a sort of jumble of black and white blobs. To me, it doesn't. To me, it's a very, very clear image. I can see that there's a woman. I can see that she's young and happy. I can see that she's wearing a hat, and I can see that she's kissing a horse. Now, you might wonder whether I'm hallucinating, and actually, to some extent, I probably am a bit. But the reason I can see all that is because I've seen this image before. This was my prior expectation about that, so that you can see the woman kissing the horse. Now, normally you'd have to look at this a good deal longer, but I'm just going to go back to the original image. Now that you have some prior information, it may be possible for at least some of you to be able to see that more clearly. And so if I go between the two, it's perhaps easier. The point being that the prior information from that picture makes this meaningful, gives it some resolution to the ambiguity. And this also works in the auditory domain very nicely. So these are some nice examples I got from Matt Davis in Cambridge. But, so I'm going to ask you to listen to this. To most people that will sound like a rather ugly clockwork bird song. Not to me, because I have prior experience. And the prior experience I have is hearing this.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
So now you have the same priors that I have. If I play the original sound,
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
it becomes much easier to disambiguate it. It's really very, very striking. Now my colleague Christoph Teufel was very intrigued. He pointed out that when you really know these images well, you start to see stuff that isn't there. So when I look at this, I can see the young woman's jawline, even though objectively it's not actually represented in that image. Because I know this image so well, I know that there should be a jawline there. So there's something that's implied in the image, but not actually there. And Christoph very cleverly thought, well, does that change the way I am actually processing something that's not there? And he did I don't want to go into great detail for reasons of time, but he did a nice little experiment in which he showed these images both before and after having seen the clear image, and he superimposed on them little patches. And these patches, I've illustrated it here much clearer than this participant can see it, but they would contain a contour, which participants were often not actually aware of because we really blurred it out. And the contour was either aligned with the contour that should be there, but isn't, or it was at right angles to it. And the question he was posing was, is it the case that if you know there should be a contour there, because you know that there's a jawline there, are you more sensitive to certain types of patches if they're aligned with that implicit contour? And he showed a very striking, across, this is I think 20 participants, a striking facilitation effect. So your ability to identify a very, very noisy contour is enhanced if you have an image in your mind of what should be there. Another example of the degree to which you can sort of shift processing on the basis of integrating with prior experience or other knowledge comes from a well-known phenomenon in cognitive neuroscience called the McGurk effect. I'm sure some of you will have come across this, if not all of you. I'm just going to play this to you now. So, if you watch this man as he speaks, ba, 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 ba. So most people will hear him uttering the sound ba, 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 ba. Now if I play the same sound, but his mouth is making a different pattern, you will hear something different, even though it's the same sound. Oops, sorry. Ba, 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 ba. So the same sound that you heard as va is now being heard as ba, because you're seeing his lips moving differently. Now you probably don't believe me, you probably think I'm playing a different sound. So I'm going to play both sound, or the same sound, but with the both images together. What I'd ask you to do is just flip your attention from one to the other. And as you do, you should actually hear the sound change. Ba, 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 ba. So that same sound is perceived very differently, just as a function of what his lips are doing, which to me is incredibly striking. So in short, just to expand on what I said earlier, the brain's striving to be a model of the world. It has these noisy sensory inputs in multiple domains, and all it's got at its disposal is abductive inference that it can optimize with prior knowledge. And I hope I've shown you that with the black and white images and the sounds, that actually that optimization process is great, because it can emphasize salient information, increase the signal, reduce the noise, increase sensitivity to subtle signals, remove ambiguity. It's a great way of working with the world. So perception itself is a highly creative inferential act. But this is worrying as well, because we've already defined hallucinations as a creative act. It's when a perception occurs in the absence of stimulus, but normal perception is dealing a lot in the absence of stimulus. So why aren't we always on the verge of hallucinations? Well, I think we are. And the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced of that. And there's some great examples. I mean, we all know that you don't have to go too far on the web to find some interesting ideas. One interesting idea I came across was the idea of reverse spin. So this is an entire website devoted to the profound insight that when I say something to you, there are two meanings in that. There's the meaning that's conveyed by the words I say, but there's also a hidden meaning, which is only discernible if you play my speech backwards. And that will tell you what I really meant. Now, I don't believe that, but there are a number of people who aren't psychotic who do believe it. And here's an example, and I think this illustrates very nicely. So this is what George Bush really thinks of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. So I'm going to play this, and he's welcoming them on a state visit. I took this from the Reverse Speech website, where there are thousands of examples of this. And first, there's what he actually says, and then there's the bit that's reversed that tells us what he really thinks.
Laura and I are honored to welcome back to the White House Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh.
That's what he said, but this is what he means.
Anyone?
So, most of us can't hear it until the person who discovered it tells us what it is, and then we can hear it very clearly. It's a great example where if you strongly believe that he's saying something backwards and you search hard enough, you're going to find something that supports that idea. The strong belief creates the evidence. Now, reverse speech is interesting. We think, well, maybe these are just crazy people. But actually, there's a phenomenon in psychology that many of you will know about, the White Christmas effect, where you tell somebody that you're going to play some little snatches of the song White Christmas in amongst a lot of white noise on their headphones, and they just have to tell you when it's being played. And most people at some point would say, ah yes, I just heard a snatch of it there, when in fact it's never being played. So all of us can superimpose signal when there is just noise. Sensory deprivation is a great example. Any one of us goes into a sensory deprivation chamber, within a short space of time we'll be seeing things and hearing things and believing things that we wouldn't have if we were getting normal sensory input. So we have a problem here. We've got this system that works really well by superimposing expectations on noisy sensory data. But the danger, of course, is that we then just shape the world to be what we believed in the first place. We're not sensitive to what the world is telling us, which of course we are. And the question is really dealt with, I think, by this notion of a mismatch or prediction error signal. The idea that the expectation generates, an expectation is generated, and then there is a sampling of the real world, and that real world either agrees or disagrees with the expectation. And that mismatch, if it's there, should be the signal that our belief is wrong and should be updated. Now that's easy in some ways, because basically you use a prediction error minimization approach and you will model the world perfectly. You remove all error in an iterative sense by updating your beliefs, and then you have a perfect model. But that only works if the world behaves itself. If all of the inputs are highly reliable, highly consistent, non-changing, but the world doesn't behave itself. And so there's this fundamental question of when do you update your beliefs or when do you ignore the mismatch? And that's something that I think cognitive neuroscience is trying to get to grips with. What are the systems in the brain that could alter in order to do that? So to summarize, before I get back to psychosis in the last part, the brain is a model of its world. Perception and belief are a consequence of this affective inference. Inference may be optimized by minimizing prediction error. In other words, being alert to when the world is telling you you're wrong. But whether you should minimize error at any given point is really dependent upon how much you trust the incoming information, how reliable your experience tells you it could be. Suppose I've done a functional neuroimaging experiment in which I get a pattern of brain activity that's distributed across the brain. Now I, as an imaging scientist, know that brain imaging data are incredibly noisy. You do 100,000 statistical tests, you will get, at a certain probability threshold, you will get a number of false positives. The question for me is, which ones are the false positives and which ones are the true positives? Which areas are really active and should be interpreted and which ones aren't? Well, I have to turn to what I expected to find in the first place. So I start believing some areas more than I do others. So I'm immediately minimizing certain prediction errors by ignoring them. I didn't expect that area to be active, so it's probably a false positive. I'm using science as a way of illustrating this because I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that these processes are... science tries to make itself immune to these processes, and that's one of the most beautiful things about it to me, is the iterative attempt to remove these biases, but it's not entirely successful. So there's a fundamental problem, and I think that fundamental problem can take us back to psychosis, which is actually, in the phrasing that I've used, the person in a state of psychosis with delusions and hallucinations is suffering, and they probably have a suboptimal modelling of the world. Well, the question is less about whether they're really right or not. It's more about they're somehow failing to make the right predictions or using their predictions in erroneous ways, I think. I don't think we need to worry about separating delusions and hallucinations, perception and belief, because as I've tried to illustrate, and as I will return to at the end, I think perception and belief are very, very closely interlinked and actually very difficult to tell apart in some ways. But I think in psychosis we can think now not of some gross derangement, but of a shift in balance. So I want to give a sort of toy example. This is not based on any real person that I've spoken to, but it's a sort of amalgamation of my clinical experience of talking to people as they describe the earliest experiences as they moved into a state of delusions and hallucinations. So imagine you're sitting in your back garden and you're listening to the radio, and there's a very unpleasant item comes on the news about somebody being murdered. Simultaneously, you can hear your neighbour in his garden next door, and he's laughing. Now, under normal circumstances, this coincidence would, one hope, be treated as just that. You don't relate the neighbours laughing to the item on the news. But suppose you've got, for example, an erroneous prediction error signal that was telling you to update your model of the world. So aberrant prediction error firing in the brain. Maybe that would be subjectively experienced as a sense that actually the laughter and the item on the news were somehow related. That your existing model of the world was wrong and would have to be updated. You may not update it immediately, but you may begin to entertain the idea that perhaps your neighbour is not the benevolent, friendly person you thought, but actually has some sinister intent. Maybe the next time you see your neighbour, he has a perfectly neutral expression on his face, but with your new prior expectation, you read that expression differently. You see some malign intent in it, you see it as sinister, you see it as sardonic. The point I'm making is that after the first set of changes, the brain or you then search for evidence in favour of your updated priors. And when you search for evidence, you find evidence, and you ignore the evidence against it. That's part of the normal process. And so we could see perhaps, and I'm not saying that prediction error is necessarily the fundamental disturbance in all cases of psychosis by any means, but we could see psychosis emerging as this shift in the balance between the prior expectations and the current input, and the way in which those are being integrated for you to either update or not update your world. Now, the thing that attracts me about this idea is, as well as having some explanatory value, it also does allow us to do experiments to test it. So as you'll have gathered, I have skepticism about functional regime in some respects. I think there are problems with it, but I do think it can allow us to probe or assay brain responses in people with different experiences and see whether those brain responses can differ in certain key areas. So one thing we spent a lot of time doing from 2000 onwards was trying to identify the areas of the brain that get very excited or get active when there is a prediction error signal. I won't go into the experiments, but the basic experiment is the same. We got people to do causal learning tasks in which they learned associations, and then when those associations were established, we would violate them to produce a prediction error. and we identified the areas of the brain that were more associated with the violation than the fulfillment of expectations. We could then use these systems, which I won't go into details, but they are ventral striatal, midbrain, and certain areas of frontal cortex, as our sort of marker for prediction error, and ask the question whether the behavior of this marker changes in people who suffer from psychotic illness. So this was published by Phil Corlett and our group in 2007. And essentially the take-home message that if we compare control individuals who don't suffer psychotic illness to patients who are under treatment for psychotic illness, then the signal for the prediction error, that's PE+, is significantly greater in these areas than for the non-prediction error. But this neural distinction, if you like, is blurred in people suffering from psychosis. And indeed, the more that likely they are to suffer from delusional type of thinking, the more blurred that signal is. We can also use pharmacological models. So one that we've used is ketamine, which can produce a transient state of subtle psychosis in healthy individuals. It's a very unpleasant state, I speak from personal experience. And fortunately, it is only very brief. So we can scan people while they're receiving an infusion of ketamine. And we can show that the same patterns change, or the same patterns occur. When somebody's under the placebo infusion of saline, they show the normal prediction error signal in this region of the frontal cortex. But that is blurred in people receiving, when the same person receives an infusion of ketamine. And you can see it's rather like the same region, the same pattern that you see in people with early psychosis. The other thing that we can do is actually posit that if, let's say, hallucinations are associated with a shift in balance between prior expectations and current input, then it's feasible that under certain circumstances, the person who's prone to hallucinations or who suffers from them will actually experience a perceptual advantage. Because if you create a situation in which you encourage people, or you require people to use their prior expectation more, then if that's what they're doing, they should be able to do that better. And my colleague Christoph Teufel recently first authored this paper, which shows precisely that. This was published a couple of months ago, I think, a month ago. And the essence of it was, he took these images, the ones you've seen already, and he compared them with other images that don't have any picture behind them at all. And he showed both sets of images to people, both before and after seeing the coloured template clear images. So essentially, you see the noisy image, you then get your prior expectations or your priors given to you, you then see them again, and you see whether people can discern them. And he did this on both people with very early psychosis-like features. I don't want to go into the clinical details, but they were people seeking help because they were starting to experience perceptual hallucinatory type anomalies. And compared that to control participants who didn't have these experiences. And the interesting thing is here, just ignore the graph on the right. This is their ability to pick out the figure in the black and white image, both before they'd seen the clear image and after it. And what you see is that both groups are pretty poor at this before, just as presumably most of you were before you'd seen the clear image. You then give them the clear image, and we find that the control participants in red show an advantage, they get better. But the people with early psychosis experiences show a much greater advantage. They get significantly better, suggesting that actually they are able to superimpose the priors that you've given them more successfully in disambiguating the images, which is actually very rare to find advantages, cognitive advantages, in groups of individuals like this who are often suffering from distress, depression, anxiety, and as a consequence find cognitive tasks quite hard. We've also shown that if you look at tendency to, well, we'll call it schizotypy. I don't really like the term, but it's a tendency to experience unusual perceptions. You find that this is just in perfectly healthy people recruited from across Cambridge, mostly in university, and the ones who show the highest tendency to odd perceptual experiences are the ones who show the greatest performance benefit. And we've replicated that. I won't go into details. So in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to just reiterate what I've said and then speculate wildly on beliefs, which is more, well, I'll add my caveat before I speculate. So, essentially what I've said is the brain is faced with these incredibly profound computational challenges in modelling the world, and I think it has to model the world. I think delusions and hallucinations, which are incredibly fuzzy concepts anyway, I must confess, may be a logical consequence of the brain's approach to solving these problems. And we don't need to posit some sort of gross derangement in order to understand them, how they emerge. I'd like to suggest, and I really do believe this, that the idea of brain as enacting predictive mechanisms, not having beliefs necessarily, because I don't think we can say that about brain stuff, but I think the way it functions as a sort of prediction sampling device, striving essentially to resolve ambiguity, can offer a powerful framework, not just for understanding psychosis, but for understanding a lot of stuff. And I would also like to argue that sometimes it feels like I'm taking a very reductionist view. I don't think this view is reductionist, actually. I think it can speak to the brain, it can speak to the neurobiological level of observation, although to what extent I think remains to be seen. But actually it speaks directly to social and environmental observations. I think a lot of our expectations are generated by social information rather than direct perceptual experience. I think that when we're talking about somebody's brain, we can't any longer think of it as an isolated brain, but really it's a model of that person's environment. If they have experienced uncertainty, adversity, unpleasantness, then their prior expectations will largely be formulated in those terms. They have become a model. And also thinking about things like irrationality as well. You can only define the rationality of behaviours in terms of the environment within which the model has been created. And again, a model that is built within an environment that's adverse, uncertain, traumatic, will expect and therefore do and sample in different ways to one that has had much more stability. So I think the observations of brain as a model of the world actually point us in two directions, downwards towards the neurobiology, but more importantly, potentially upwards to personal experience and personal history. So this is the bit where I just add some speculation. The caveat really is that I don't think I have anything privileged to say about the nature of beliefs. I certainly don't think that pointing at brains or pointing at blogs on brains really explains much about beliefs. If we know what the activity in given regions means in terms of information processing, perhaps that will allow us to adjudicate between competing or different models of beliefs. But ultimately, an expression of what a belief is can't be separated from the world outside and the person as a whole, and can't really be located to brain areas, I think. And I should add that what I say here is possibly a sort of preludial footnote to the session that follows, which is much more, I think, about the nature of beliefs in the brain, and I think I'm looking forward to hearing that. So the principles that I think that emerge from the things I've said are, firstly, perception and belief are not easily separable. I think it's very difficult, actually, particularly if you take things like hallucinations, to say that's a perceptual phenomenon, because it's a belief as well. It's a belief about the origin of that experience, and it's created by one's prior expectations, as I said. So even when they're descriptively distinct, it is feasible that they're governed by processes and principles that at a neural level are highly overlapping. Perhaps the distinction between perception and belief actually reflects descriptions of the same processes, but just expressed at different levels and in different domains. So we potentially have a hierarchy moving from what we call perception to what we call belief, but within that iterative hierarchy, there is the possibility that the same sorts of processes are being enacted, but they have different connotations at different levels. So perhaps moving up the hierarchy, the levels, so at each level we have prior expectation plus current input and mismatch or not, with a mismatch being fed forward. But perhaps what changes as we move up the hierarchy is that the priors, I hesitate to call them beliefs, but I'll call them prior expectations, maybe beliefs, are based upon much more complex causal integrated relationships. They're more general and immutable, much less likely to be challenged by an individual experience, increasingly shaped by social rather than sensory information, more tolerant of mismatch. This really relates to the idea that they are immutable, and have a greater influence on how we shape our lives, attend to and sample the world. But irrespective of that sort of qualitative difference going up the hierarchy from low-level perceptions, what we call perception, to high-level, what we call belief, in each case the signal is shaped by an integration of an expectation and an input. And each signal is represented by potentially a distribution of probabilities, and the nature of this distribution determines how it contributes. So we have beliefs about our beliefs, if you like. We have beliefs about how reliable information is and how much our belief should be updated on the basis of a given set of information. So, example, if I do a functional neuroimaging study on language and I don't find activity in Broca's area, that is in one of the key language areas, I'm not going to immediately update my model to say that Broca's area has nothing to do with language. What I'm going to do is say, well, actually, I know that this particular input, this brain image, is noisy, and this might be one of those instances in which there's a false negative. So having an understanding of what the precision of any given signal is very important to determining how you shift your beliefs. But in the end, all I really have to say is this. Strong priors do create their own evidence. I think that's undeniable in all spheres of life. And weak priors prevent us from dealing with noise and uncertainty. So somehow we have to find that balance. If we're too weak and we don't use prior information, we live the world like a baby with just sensory inputs that are not assembled into meaning. If we over-rely on our priors, then we essentially create the world rather than experiencing it. And on that note, thank you very much for attending, and I'd be happy to deal with criticism and questions. Thank you.
So Paul, that was fabulous. So can I make a comment just to give you a bit of a breather and then some questions? So I completely sign up to your argument, and I just want to make an anatomical point that's well known to you, but possibly not to everyone, which is the anatomical correlates of what you're saying is the huge investment the brain has made into correcting the sense organs at the site of the sense organs. So to give you an example of this, the optic nerve, which carries information from the back of the eye to the brain, has 20% of its fibers going from the brain to the retina to control retinal activity. In the cochlea, the hearing organ, it's even higher. 40% of the fibers going in the hearing nerve are from the brain to the cochlea, which pulls little muscles which influence the vibration of the cochlea and what can be heard. So not only do we have this high-level interpretation of what we see, but we actually influence the very primary sensation through our priors. So it's embedded in anatomy. So that was my comment.
Yeah.
My question is, I sign up to the view that all perception is belief. But as we go about our daily business, we have a clear difference in our own mind between what is belief and what is fact. And in a secular society, it's quite clear that there are some things that are just facts, and there are some things that are beliefs, and when people use that term belief, they mean, I guess, something that's not immediately verifiable. And to put that into your language, I guess what we'd say is that the ordinary understanding of belief might be one in which there's not a quick or an overt mismatch, that you have to wait a long time to get a mismatch, or it's not very striking to you. So if you have a belief in a deity or whatever, unless something very extraordinary happens, that can go on for a long time without there being a mismatch. So maybe that's part of the hierarchy. Whereas if you have a belief about the dragon in front of you, it will be pretty quickly sorted out whether that's true or not. with all this. So I just wonder about that. So verifiability, the rapidity of the mismatch.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I was rather clumsy and sort of and hurried in trying to think about this hierarchy from perception to belief. But I think one other thing that would change across that is the time scale of entity. So, for example, you could imagine, this is a bit of a toy example, but I believe myself to be in the wood, and I have lots of perceptual sensory evidence in that favour. It means that if I see something green waving here, that perceptual change is framed within that overall belief system that it's a leaf. It could well be that I discover it's a grasshopper or something. That shifts the lower level at a fairly rapid scale, but it would take quite a lot to make me shift my belief that I'm in a wood. And I think that sort of immutability, slow time scale, is what characterises what we would call beliefs. What we call facts versus what we call our beliefs, I think is more difficult. I mean, I think it would be to do with the sort of the precision that we attribute to that prior. If we really have a very, very strong prior, then it will take an awful lot for us to come up with an abductive inference that is shifted a long way from that prior.
Yeah, so maybe if we frequently find that prior to be fulfilled, we register that frequency and it becomes more concrete.
Yeah, so just to answer that, this is essentially the idea about beliefs,
Yes.
Which I think we're very, very good at keeping track of.
Chris. Thank you very much. Really lovely talk. So perception and action are inextricably entwined, and what we do to perceive the world really is probe it, turn it around, look at it from the other side, and make sure that we're perceiving it in the way our priors are expecting to perceive it. So I wonder, therefore, we heard yesterday Irene Tracy talking a little bit about control freaks versus people who have a sense of who allow the possibility that there's an external agent. And I wonder whether, therefore, people who have psychotic tendencies, hallucinations, have less of an inclination to probe the world themselves and more of an acceptance of the possibility that there may be something outside themselves that is causing their perceptions. Do you see what I mean? So
yeah,
they're less inclined to change and explore and prove that their hallucinations are indeed hallucinatory.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I'm glad you raised the point about perception and action being so intimately interlinked, and I think that's something that can feel counterintuitive, but actually, one way of minimizing your error signal is actually to change the world by acting upon it, and also to change the world, or change your perception of the world by changing how you sample it. And I think there's lots of instances of that occurring. With respect to your point about whether people who suffer from psychosis are less inclined to, or feel less able to impose themselves on the world and actually attribute it to an external agent, I think that's a really interesting point to follow. There are a couple of things I could say. I don't think I have any evidence, really. One thing I would say is that I'm often asked, well, if this is your theory about why somebody comes to hold a delusion, why are delusions all the same? Why does it, which they're not, but they often have a very persecutory feel. In the end, what it's down to is a person or a group of people who are somehow interfering with your world and making things rotten and miserable for you. I actually think that there's something interesting about that idea, because I think it has an enormous amount of explanatory power. And so it might be logically the consequence of having lots and lots of instances of feeling that something's not right. So there are 3 red cars out there. That's more than a coincidence. My neighbour laughed while the radio was on. That's not a coincidence. I'd lost my door key. That wasn't carelessness. How can you explain all those things going on all day? Maybe an unseen persecutor is a great way of doing it. Maybe it is the rational explanation of all of those experiences. But the other point is this attribution to the world rather than to yourself, which has been a very important component of trying to understand, say, voices and things, that it's your inner voice, but you attribute it to the world. I think there's something in that. I think that One big difference between what you do and what other people do is that sensory consequences of what you do aren't surprising. There's no prediction error. You can't tickle yourself, for example, because you strongly expect the sensory input that you get if you tickle yourself. I know if I'm planning a movement to this pointer, what the sensory input will be when I've arrived. Now, if I made that same movement and it felt surprising, then maybe the consequence of that would be that it felt external. That a surprise is synonymous with coming from the outside, whereas non-surprise is synonymous with being self-generated. That's a fairly old idea in psychiatry of psychosis. So I'm speculating a bit. I mean, I think to take your point about perception and action being intimately entwined, I think that's going to be a really powerful thing to be thinking about in thinking about psychosis.
Right.
Paul, thanks very much. This is a really wonderful talk. I just wanted to push you a little bit on the idea of collapsing the distinction between perception and belief. Just coming back to this fabulous example you had where the ball bearings roll uphill, or they appear to roll uphill. I'm not sure exactly what would happen in that situation after so the camera pans around and you see what's actually going on. If you were to watch the initial video again, I'm not exactly sure what your percept would be, but it seems that there are at least some visual illusions and other sorts of perceptual illusions where even when you understand that it is an illusion, you can't help but see it as an illusion. So it seems there that it seems to me that you need a distinction between perception and belief for those kinds of cases, because there are times when you like say the Muller-Lyer illusion, for instance, you believe that the lines are actually the same length because you know how the illusion works, yet you cannot help but perceive them as being of different lengths. So that I'm not sure how you would respond to that.
Well, that's a good point. So I mean, it's definitely true that visual illusions are often very striking and they exert their pleasurable effects by the fact that we know that they're illusions, but still we see it as the hollow mask illusion many of you may have seen, where you can't help but see a hollow face has been pointing out because you so strongly believe that faces point out. I'm not sure that this, I think this would, I don't think it necessarily challenges the idea that the same iterative processes underpin both perception and belief. I think it certainly strongly suggests that there's stuff at the top end that has a great deal of power with respect to, or remains impervious to what's coming up from below. So the conscious experience is still of a pointed arch, even though you know it's not a pointed arch. But it still seems to me that you could imagine a disruption to a process that affects both perception and belief in highly comparable ways, because the underlying mechanics at each level are highly comparable. Now, at the top level, it would be silly to imagine, I mean, at the bottom level, you can imagine there's one cause, one expectation, one effect. At the top level, there are multiple inputs to that region, so it's receiving an awful lot of signals and has a lot of downward signals. So it will necessarily hold information or process information in some ways that are different. But I still think that there may be some fundamental mechanics of the process that are really common at all levels. But I can't dispute that we all know that we all experience beliefs as being different perception. I think at that high level subjective case, that's indisputable. But I just can't help but think that there's processes, mechanical processes, that are really shared across all levels.
Thanks.
Right.
Well, thanks again for your talk. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Wonderful illustration. I'm trying to make theological connections too to what you've been talking about, and I'm just wondering. I mean, is it established that the relationship, to go back to an earlier question, between fear and psychosis? Would you see fear as more cause of psychosis or result of psychosis? And also, when you have not necessarily all surprises in terms of the senses are bad ones. I mean, if you have a really good surprise, theologically speaking, we might talk in terms of grace. But what do you think about fear?
Well, firstly, I think it's incredibly important in the sufferer's experience of the psychotic illness. And I would say that there are many instances where people have beliefs that the psychiatrist would consider unfounded, irrational, impervious to contradictory evidence that we wouldn't call delusions. So, just trying to think of examples, but there certainly are cases of people who, I mean, there's someone called Emmanuel Peters who studies individuals, spiritualists and medium, which are beliefs that, you know, could fall into the delusion set. But these are very pro-social beliefs. They're not accompanied by fear. They actually engender self-worth and they generate pleasure in others as well. And I think the big difference between the clinical psychosis, so-called clinical psychosis, and the non-clinical is in the emotion that's attached to it. And I think you often find that in the people I've seen who've presented suffering from psychosis, fear is a huge part of it. Fear, uncertainty, anxiety. Now the question is it that drives the psychosis, or is it the experience of the psychosis that drives that? I don't think we can distinguish. I would say that there are certainly first-person reports where people say that at the early stages, as they were beginning to experience the world differently, it wasn't all bad, actually. It was, some people have described how the world seemed to sparkle with vibrancy and was much more interesting. And they were more sensitive to coincidences, and it felt good. It felt like they were on the verge of discovering something exciting. And it's only beyond that that the fear set in as they realised that actually there's something sinister going on. So that's one instance in which it may well be that the psychosis seems to precede the fear. But I also think there's plenty of increasing evidence that the baseline for developing delusions and hallucinations actually is profound anxiety. And that, you know, I think one thing that I didn't talk about, but it seems to me that if you do believe this idea that the brain is trying to model the world by minimizing error, then the one thing it doesn't like is uncertainty. And I think uncertainty is a highly stressful thing, but it would also be a driver of new explanations and new ways of seeing the world, new ways of modeling it. So I realise I'm skirting around your question a lot. My feeling is that fear is both a really important driving force, but also it emerges from the psychosis. And we know that fear shapes how you process percepts as well. I mean, if you're walking along a dark road and you see a pillar box, it looks much more like an assailant than if it's a bright sunny day.
Okay. I wondered if you maybe give your opinion about the current view that the self is a delusion and agency is a delusion, the free will issue. I know these are big issues, but it must impinge on your
solve
thoughts.
the hard problem.
Yes, exactly. Because in a sense, that's why we're here.
Right. I mean, I find it hard. It seems to me a sort of nonsensical idea that the self is a delusion. You know, the self is an experience of a conglomeration of experiences, and if we choose to call it self, then great. I just don't think that you can't deny experiences. I mean, Descartes said that, and very sensibly so. The idea that agency is an illusion, I think there's some, you know, replicated evidence that the stuff that goes on in the brain before we're aware that we're about to do something. So that many people will be aware of the famous Libet experiment from 1983 in which they recorded motor activity and they got people to identify, to move just when they felt like it, and to identify the point at which they felt the desire to move and the point at which they made the movement. And they did it on this sort of clock apparatus, where was the hand pointing when it happened. And Libet showed that the so-called Bereitschaft potential, the readiness potential in the brain, was active some 300 milliseconds before they were aware of the desire to move. So, you know, the hard line on that is, well, the brain knows it before you do, then the brain has decided before you do. I don't really buy that. I mean, if you've ever used the Libet clock, it's incredibly noisy. And I don't actually think I have anything to say about free will. I mean, I have lots of things to say about all of it, but I don't think I have anything sensible to say. So if you want to...
Well, we will tackle this later on this morning, so please, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for a really lovely talk.
Thank you.
And you show that perception and belief is, rather than separate categories of things, are a scale, and one merges into the other. And you've shown that we can look and explore perceptions, physical perceptions, because they're objectively available to study in a way that faith beliefs are not, because they're at the other end and they're not available to study in the same way. But what I found in some work that I did was that if you ask people of their faith and then study what they say and analyse what they say, what you get is a massive construction, how they build up and build up and build up their faith. And narrative psychologists will call that their narrative, and that's all very well understood, and discursive psychologists will explore how it's done, and that's all very well understood. And but what's interesting, I think, from comparing this with your talk and your perspective is that, if I can use that word, is that when I ask my subjects about their faith, they would say, yes, okay, well it all began, and off they would go, and then they speak for a long time. But they would go way back in their histories, way back in their social history. So one woman I started talked about her faith, talked about her parents' upbringing, not even her own upbringing.
Right.
And what I'm saying is that what they're doing is constructing some whole edifice, which is extremely embedded in their roots, which they then use as this prior model for determining their experiences, physical experiences. So one woman told me a heap of what we would call ghost stories. She did see voices and see lights and things. But they were perfectly acceptable because they were put into a concept of a faith which she had prior built up. And then these prior expectations could then help them when they faced challenges in their lives which might move or change their faith. In some cases they would change their faith, it would break their faith. But I think this notion of the prior expectation model seems to fit my social data in a way pretty much parallel with your physical stuff. And I put that in as an observation.
Yeah, well, thanks for that observation. I mean, I think as you were describing it, it sprung to mind that actually taking this view, good models and bad models are not defined by veracity, truth, but how functional they are. And so the psychosis can be seen as a bad model, not because the beliefs inherent and experiences are wrong or untrue, but because they're causing, they're leading the person to malpredict the world and to feel and experience suffering. But you know what we really want, I want my experience of the world to be useful. Actually, I want it to help me to get through things. I think the degree to which it faithfully represents the actual objective reality is another matter, and it would be nice if it did. But I can see no reason why the brain would set that a particularly high sort of value on that, except insofar as it coincides with being successful. But thank you for making the comment. I think that's really powerful to hear it expressed that way as a narrative, and I agree entirely.
Hi, sorry if this seems a dark question. Instead of the model of this being malpredictive, has it been investigated? I was curious with the girl who could hear her sister's voices. Investigate, was she hearing it correctly? Is there, if you do see 3 cars that are all red, is that potty? I mean, is there a tiny grain of some additional truth in some of these seemingly bizarre experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and it's not done. There's a phenomenon that people refer to as apophenia, which is a hypersensitivity to patterns in the world. And I think that people who subsequently emerge in psychosis often go through a period of apophenia where they are seeing patterns and coincidences that perhaps are genuinely reflective of an underlying true pattern in the way things relate to each other. And it's very easy I think we see this in science a lot. Scientific breakthroughs are often seen in the first place as being, pipe dreams and sort of seeing something that. The Nobel Prize was awarded for the treatment of ulcers based upon the idea that it wasn't the classic gastric acid, but it was actually somebody had the idea that it was related to this bacterial infection. And I think it's perfectly feasible that subtle regularities in the world that escape a lot of us are seen by some people are more sensitive to them. And I should add that the content of the psychotic state, the delusion, the voice, is not rendered meaningless by virtue of the fact that you can try and come up with a mechanism. The content still reflects the preoccupations and understanding of the person who is experiencing it, and therefore is a very important part of that experience.
I was interested in what the lady said over there about if you ask somebody about their faith, it's embedded experience. And I recognise in people I've interviewed that certainly faith experience in dementia is very largely dependent on the priors. However, I feel talking to those people that there's a definite sense of the external agency of God as well. And obviously I speak as a theologian and not as a scientist. But that sense of external agency is very positive in terms of a person's well-being. It's not just a product. Ostensibly in conversation, you wouldn't say it's just a product of what they've learned. It's something which is transforming their lives. In terms of hallucination, recently in a chaplaincy context, there was a lady in advanced dementia who was very disturbed, and we were trying to reassure her that she was safe, that God was with her, and she just suddenly broke out of the conversation from being distressed, looked up and said, "I can see Jesus." And you're thinking, okay, so that's good. So that, I was just thinking about the hallucination that you talked about as being negative and as being internal, whereas this lady was in an internal state of disturbance and being anxious, but her faith presumably meant that she could say, "I can see Jesus," literally. And then she was transformed from being troubled to being peaceful and joyful. And I know that the general point, as a scientist, everything is reduced to the cells and the neurons and the synapse and what's happening. But I think there's a place also for mystery. And I think there's a place for me to stand back and say, yeah, I've pursued the knowledge as far as I can. But in the end, this lady's hallucination was positive. And I don't know. And mystery's okay.
I think it would be deeply unscientific to assert fact beyond what one actually really knows from the data, and I think the scientist has to understand that there are levels of uncertainty and mystery that cannot be captured within their particular
science. Could it be that there is reality beyond the scientific model, which scientists are?
Reality that we can't quantify and measure?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Part of who we are as people.
Sorry?
Part of who we are as human beings, as people.
Yeah, but would you suggest that because science can't quantify and measure it now, that it will never be quantifiable or measurable?
No, I don't know.
No, nor do I. I think it would be a very foolish scientist to assume that their existing panoply was all that they would ever have to understand human experience. And I would also, I think, I hope I was sufficiently diffident in making statements about belief, because I don't think that somebody who studies the brain has any particular privileged status with respect to saying anything about belief. Beliefs are expressed in so many ways at so many different levels that a neuroscientist can say some things. They can say what the sort of the territory looks like wherein beliefs somehow emerge, but about beliefs themselves and how they relate to each other and what shapes them, I don't think we can. And I like your point. I think just one of the points about the the woman whom you referred to as having a faith that seemed to be not learned but embedded in her priors. I think that's very interesting, and I think how we develop these priors and expectations is absolutely fascinating. I mean, you could argue, and this is sort of probing you a little, that one prior she might have is that if something is difficult to understand, unpredictable, and inherently not joined up to me, then that suggests that somebody else is involved, there's something else going on. And so that prior might be enough to shift you towards thinking about external powers rather than internal causality. But, you know, these things probably function in very complex ways. The other thing, of course, is that I've emphasised, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around, I've emphasised the suffering that people have because of these experiences. There are many cases, and I've spoken to people who've been through this, where they find it incredibly rewarding, where the voice is nice, where it talks to them and supports them, and you're supposed to recognise that.
And very often the crisis actually is the trigger for the positive hallucination or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.